Hi, welcome to Ancient Mysteries Unearthed podcast, episode number 3. And today's topic is all about astronomy, but not just any kind of astronomy, archaeoastronomy. What is archaeoastronomy in the first place? Well, I had no idea for a long time, but it's essentially what it sounds like, which is archaeology and astronomy combining together to form a very, very interesting discipline. Why would we even need to have a type of archaeology that involves astronomy? Well, the ancients seem to be obsessed with bringing the stars down onto Earth. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically aligning their temples, their structures to the cosmos. Sometimes it was aligning them to the summer and winter solstices, the spring and fall equinoxes, and other constellations, other stars. Depending on where you were in the world and depending on the type of site it was, they typically were aligned to the cosmos. Why? Well, to better answer that, I've got on the show today John Lundwall. John holds a doctorate in comparative myth and religion. He's also an author, a speaker. I was so thrilled that he could come onto the show today and talk to us in more detail about archaeoastronomy, what it is, why it's important. We're going to cover these incredibly mysterious petroglyphs found all over Utah. Later on, we're going to go to Egypt and discuss both of our interpretations of the structures that we found in Egypt, their astronomical significances. So without further ado, let's start the episode. I'll come back at the end for a couple of words in closing. Enjoy. Hi, welcome to Ancient Mysteries Unearthed, and I'm your host, Chris Noble, and today is episode number 3 of the podcast, and I'm so excited to be talking about a very interesting subject called archaeoastronomy. And this is an area of study that doesn't get a lot of attention. I don't think a lot of people are aware of it, but it's a form of archaeology that is becoming more and more popular as it seems to do a lot of help with dating some of these sites based on astronomical alignments and things of that nature. Now, we're going to go a lot more into the details of this during our podcast. So I wanted to welcome to the show today John Lundwall, who I was very fortunate enough to meet in Egypt when I was on a trip there, which I've mentioned in a past podcast recently, with Robert Schoch and Mohammed Ibrahim, amongst many other wonderful individuals. And John has a really interesting, unique take on our archaeoastronomy and has done some very interesting research actually in the United States. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome John to the show. John, how are you doing today?
Good, thank you, Chris, for having me on your show.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
Good to see you again.
So good to see you. And the second I see your face, I just picture myself on the Nile cruise that we were on, having a beer, floating right down the Nile. Not a bad life, right?
Not bad. It was 115 degrees, and we had to get up at 2 a.m. every day, but not bad at all.
Yeah, and I tell people, I mean, like, it was a great trip, but I wouldn't call it a vacation.
No, that's right.
So, but thanks for coming here today, and I really appreciate it. And I would love for you to just maybe introduce yourself to our audience. You know, what's a brief little background on yourself and your studies that have brought you to this study of archaeoastronomy, but also let's explain to the audience, what is archaeoastronomy?
All right, just a little bit about myself. I have a doctorate in comparative myth and religious studies from Pacifica Graduate School out of South California. And actually, during my graduate studies, I kept running into cosmological motifs in ancient religions, ancient mythologies, and the theorists of ancient myth sometimes address it, but most of them don't. And I just remember one night reading and realizing this horrible, horrible thing that I had to spend a year or two learning the sky because I didn't know it. And in order to understand what I was reading, the theorists weren't talking about it. So turns out I built my own telescope, became a founding board member of the Utah Valley Astronomy Club. It's a 501c3. We partner with the state and national parks to run their astronomy programs. So I'm an author, a lecturer, a presenter, editor on academic journals. My area of expertise is ancient oral societies, oral cosmology, and how oral peoples transmit information. And It's rather a shocking oversight that in most of our theoretical texts, both in ancient history and in archaeoastronomy, most scholars admit that there's a lot of astronomy in these ancient religions and ancient myths, but they don't really, they're all surprised by it. Why? And there's really no good answer. Well, let me tell you why. In oral societies without writing, the sky becomes a sort of printing press. Okay? This is how they transmit information. They watch when a certain star, sun, moon, planet rises on the horizon in a certain configuration. And when that happens, that tells them when to tell a myth. Myths weren't just campfire stories. They were very often you had to tell them in their proper season, and you couldn't tell them outside of that season. You performed a ritual in association with that, and you performed your cultural functions in association with the celestial luminaries. And so the entire cultural library then, the memory library, was encoded in nature, and that included the stars. And so as they rose and set throughout the year, your cultural library rose and set throughout the year. And so that is why we find ancient astronomical, cosmological motifs embedded. I mean, Egypt is full of it. And so archaeoastronomy, I don't know that, so I am the project leader of an archaeoastronomy project in southern Utah. And I'll talk about this as we start the presentation, but I was down at a state park in southern Utah running an astronomy program for them. Utah, I live in the state of Utah. Utah has more international dark sky registrations than anywhere else in the country, in the United States. So basically every state national park within Utah, and there are a lot, are getting registered for dark sky status through international association. So I was down at this park just to help them do that. I was giving a lecture and running star parties through the night. I didn't know anything about the ancient Fremont people who inhabited present-day Utah. Sorry, I got to turn my volume down off my phone.
That's all good.
But while I was there, we'll talk about what I discovered. And it actually changed the course of my research, because I've spent the last 2 years dumping a ton of time and hours and money looking at some of the things that I'm going to be showing you tonight. So what is archaeoastronomy? Well, archaeoastronomy is the mix between astronomy and archaeology. So you go to a site, a week after we returned from Egypt, I led a tour group to Chaco Canyon. Most people are unaware of Chaco Canyon, but that's in New Mexico, northwest New Mexico. It's the largest archaeological site in North America. Has these huge pueblo complexes, some of them with 800 rooms, right? This is not like a little hut. This is massive. It's a 5-story structure with multiple kivas. And they were surprised to find that most of these pueblo complexes are astronomically aligned. And they're astronomically aligned to the rising, setting sun on a solstice date or an equinox date. And some of the pueblos are aligned to lunar cycles, and that is very sophisticated. And we won't be getting into that tonight, but the truth of the matter is the Anasazi of Chaco Canyon are the only known people to track the lunar maximum and minimum standstill. I'm not going to explain that, maybe on another podcast.
Sure.
But we have determined that the Fremont, where we're studying, also did it. And so that's exciting new discoveries that have yet to be published in a journal, but we're quite happy about that. So archaeoastronomy is seeing the archaeology of a site and then noticing that it's attached to astronomical cycles. And so that tells us something else about the culture.
Well, I think it says a lot of things though. So there's two things that jump out to me. One, is this not a method that we can now use to potentially date these sites to when they were perfectly aligned? Because I know that the alignments do shift over time, do they not?
Yeah, for some that would be true. What I am studying is mostly sun and moon. That doesn't really shift. The background of stars shifts due to precession of the equinoxes. And so if an alignment is to a star, then you could date that. That's very difficult to do because one, you have to know that it's aligned to a star, and then backtrack it. And that's a lot of speculation to begin with. So unless you have some sort of hint that you're looking for a stellar alignment as opposed to a solar lunar alignment, then, but the answer is yes, you could. I mean, this was the case that Norman Lockyer wrote about in the journal Nature, that many of the Egyptian temples were aligned to stars, and he started dating them. And he gets them really early. He dates them like one precessional cycle back, 26,000 years back. Most of that's been deconstructed now, but still, it's a good method to look at, and it is a good way. It is a possible way to date structures.
Yeah, and I think then the second thing for me, that kind of question that comes up with that though, is what kind of a civilization and what kind of a human being builds this way? We obviously don't build this way now, and if we do, I would imagine the reasons for doing so are very, very different. Through your research, even if it's just speculation, what have you kind of come to some sort of a conclusion about what kind of human beings were these that would, like, why do you have to align these sites to the cosmos, you know?
Oral peoples build this way. We don't. We've lost. So there's a when writing is invented in the 4th millennium BCE, the brain begins to rewire itself, and it takes millennium to rewire it to where we're at. And that process, by the way, Chris, keeps going. Our brain is still rewiring itself through the audiovisual age, and we don't know where that's going to lead us. After the invention of the printing press, people learned a deep analytical thought structure that included deep meditation and reading text. We're losing that with the internet, with Google, with audiovisual. We are now a multitasking cognitive structure where we look at a lot but is very shallow. And so, the question is, can you produce some really heavy work? Can you invent calculus in the basement like Newton did? With a Google mindset, and there's a lot of people says that you can't. But in the ancient world, as I already mentioned, without writing, and from writing 3200, 3400 BCE, all the way till really 600 BCE, through all that time, most of civilization did not read or write. Less than 10% of any civilization could read or write, and so while writing exists, they're still operating within an oral framework of comprehension. And so you ask, what kind of people would build their structures to astronomical alignments? Well, the people who use astronomical alignments to keep their culture intact, that's the kind of people. And it turns out that that's the way it was for tens of thousands of years. They were doing this in prehistory. I mean, one of the things about the Egyptian culture is from the first dynasty, from day one, the first pharaoh, there was a solar, lunar, and stellar calendar. So that means the Egyptians didn't invent it; they inherited it. And so, now who are the proto-Egyptians that did all that before the building of the pyramids? Well, we have no idea. Right, but the entire mythological, cosmological, religious structure of Egypt appears like a thunderclap on the horizon from the very first dynasty. And so this stuff has been calculated. I mean, we get ancient history really wrong. For most of the 20th century, everyone believed that everyone in the prehistorical past were a bunch of primitives, you know, grunting in their cave. And this is just balderdash. It's absurd. You know, I, on the other hand, you know, on that Egypt trip, there are a lot of people talking about time portals and levitation machines. I don't go there at all, Chris. I am a defender of academic method, but at the same time, you know, academia has prejudices, and one of the prejudices is everyone in the past is more primitive thinker, and that's just simply wrong. They were oral thinkers, and that has different advantages and different disadvantages. And oral people cannot create a microchip and launch someone to the moon. You know, you need permanent text layered in thousands of vertical layers in order to learn how to do that. Oral peoples did not do that. But oral peoples did build the Great Pyramid. And if you just think about that for a second, that is a jaw dropper, right?
Yeah.
And you know, the Assyriologist Neugbauer criticizes ancient Egypt, and he says, "Oh, the ancient Egyptians, they had no advanced mathematics, no advanced astronomy. We don't really have to pay attention to them." And I just think he misreads history like so many academics do. The Egyptians did have basic math. They didn't have calculus. They had trigonometry and geometry, right? But look what they did with it. Look at those temples. Look at those pyramids. We don't even know how they built them anymore. It's a lost art.
It is.
Right? And so, so the mathematics, the astronomy, the cosmology of Egypt couldn't get a man to the moon, but that was not its intention. Its intention was to bring the moon to man, to bring the stars and sun to man, to analogically copy the celestial cycles in the rituals, in the myths, in the temples, as a way to keep the civilization going. If you could map the civilization to the celestial archetypes that surrounded you, you were living the good life. That's the oral mindset. So that's why archaeoastronomy is prevalent wherever we look in ancient history.
And it's really amazing. And for our audience watching, he's very kindly put together a PowerPoint that we're gonna get right into, actually. And John, if you want to maybe pull that up, I'll just quickly let our audience know just a thought that popped into my head, which was, it's also the most timeless form of any kind of communication, any kind of almost documentation, is this form of using astronomy, because that's timeless in a sense. It's pretty well timeless. So you can just see how that's probably one of your best forms of timeless communication is through astronomy, right?
Right.
So here we go. Now, do you want to give the audience a bit of a background on, this is your project, right, that you're working on?
This is my project. I'm the project leader. I started it. I've assembled a few researchers. I'll tell you about them. And so, the discoveries you're going to see tonight, I made or we made. No one else has made.
Fantastic.
So some of it's kind of exciting stuff.
Great.
So if you don't mind, I'll just get right into it.
Yeah, take her away.
Ask questions as you go.
Oh, yeah.
So Clear Creek Canyon is a canyon in south central Utah. So here on the right, you have an image of the state of Utah. This pin here is the location of Clear Creek Canyon. I've got a digital image with different sites that labeled that we are studying. So we've divided the canyon up into different observing zones, and we're just looking at different sites along that canyon. So there was a people living in what is now present-day Utah, and it's present-day Utah, parts of Colorado, parts of Nevada, but most of it was all along the mountain range in present-day Utah. And these people are called the Fremont Indians. And they're named after the Fremont River, which is where one of the first archaeological sites was discovered that were Fremont Indian. And of course, the Fremont River is named after John C. Fremont, a European explorer who named the river. So the Fremont Indians are named after a European explorer.
Classic. Yeah.
Right. But so we have no idea what they named themselves. We have no idea what their language was. They left no writing, right, except rock art. They appear in, Utah, ancient Utah, at about 300 CE is the earliest date. 500 CE is a more mainstream date. 1350 CE, they disappear. By the late 14th century, they're gone. And we don't know where they came from, and we don't know where they went.
What kind of evidence is there, like, of them leaving? Is it kind of like, did it look like it was very all of a sudden or gradual?
Within about a century, all the villages are empty. They're gone. And so, there's all kinds of theories. No one knows why, but there's all kinds of theories as to why that could have happened. And it's probably a mixture of climate change and internal and external pressures, including competing other tribes, warfare. So there's a warming period that occurs that extends their growing season from about 9 to 1200 CE, and that's when all the villages really blossom, right? But then that warming period starts to end, and it gets into quite bitter cold in the winters and longer winters, and so it's a lot more hard to keep your crops growing. They grew corn, beans, squash, and then if it's harder to get, and then your crops get pillaged by a neighboring tribe a couple of years in a row, and then it gets really difficult.
That would do it. Yeah.
So migration, they migrate out. We don't know. They probably migrated out in different directions. We think they're connected to the southwestern Puebloan complex. So the Hopi and the Zuni, they come after the Fremont, but they're probably related to the southwestern. Other people suggest other tribes that they're related to, but the research seems to indicate that they're linked to the southwestern complex. Tons of stuff is coming up from Mexico and Central America. So there's all kinds of influence that is going on between these tribes, and we know so very little about it. You have to understand that 95% of history has evaporated everywhere. It's gone.
Unreal.
And so much of what we think is it's deeply speculative.
It is, right? And that's the thing. I think a lot of people don't quite realize when you read that in a textbook, you're not necessarily reading the 100% confirmed truth. There's so much that we don't know, obviously, right? Which you're just mentioning here. And could you comment a bit more on the migration and the influence that seems to, I've heard this from other sources that have come from South America, potentially maybe even some Mayan or Aztec influence that has found its way up into North America, because obviously this was all big one landmass. This isn't necessarily South and North America at that time, right? Right.
So, down at Chaco in New Mexico, they've discovered all kinds of things that came up from Mexico. Coatl feathers, feathers of birds that only live in Mexico or Central America. There are petroglyphs that, like horned serpents. That's Mexican, Central American, and you find them in the Southwest. Wow. There are mass of, one of the things academics do is they primitivize all the past, and they say everyone's just a howling barbarian, which is wrong. Another thing they do is they romanticize the past, and they say, oh, everyone was living with nature, and they were communing with the spirits, and they had a more wholesome, psychic culture and environment. The Aztecs, the Aztecs were hunting other tribes down and for human sacrifices, and flaying them alive, and you actually see in some petroglyphs in the Southwest a human mask. So there's a guy and he's wearing a face, and the face is a face. They've cut it off someone.
That's next level Halloween costume.
So this is There's little elements like that you find in the North American Southwest that are coming up from Mexico and Central America.
Okay.
And part of those cultural elements, some of them are spectacular. Central America is full of archaeoastronomy. Those civilizations down there, the Maya patterned their entire cities off of celestial coordinates.
That's right.
So it's so if that influence is coming up into the nomadic tribes in North America, then boom, there you go. There's, but you know, that tends to be the direction academics go.
Right.
The truth of the matter is, influence can go the other way too. It can come from North America down into Mexico.
Yeah.
Again, we just there are vast stretches of blank spots on our historical canvas, and we just fill them in with thousands of textbooks. I mean, the less you know, the more you can write about it.
So true.
You know, we just have to be. When it comes to the Fremont, there are, you know, look, there is obsidian and turquoise in the canyon that do not occur naturally in the canyon, and they can actually be traced to their sources. And so we know that the site that I'm studying, they had contact with people in the Chaco complex. The turquoise comes from Nevada, so they had contact there. There's Pacific seashells. So seashells are coming from the Pacific Ocean through Nevada into Utah. So there's contact going south and west and probably east. Again, so that's what we know. I'm just going to show you these 4 pictures here is how we identify Fremont Native Americans, because this is how they're identified. This upper left, they made a plain grayware pottery. It's not very decorative. It's really plain and simple and gray. And so if you find grayware pottery in the southwest ancient Utah, that's Fremont. They made moccasins from the lower leg height of game animals. All the other Southwest tribes wore sandals. So this is really unique to the Fremont. They lived in pit houses, which, you know, they dig 3 feet down into the dirt and then build sort of a 4-post lean-to and then cover it with adobe.
It's actually pretty smart, you know, good insulation, right?
Oh, excellent insulation. They were very small, like 8 to 10 feet in diameter, and that's where your family would live.
Wow.
And so, but the entrance to it was through a ladder from the top, so they would climb in and out of it from the top. And so that's how they lived in those structures. And then the Fremont had a really unique form of rock art. This image is cut off, but they're anthropomorphic figures. Their humanoid figures have a trapezoidal torso, which is different than other petroglyph forms that you see. And so when you see that trapezoid torso, invariably it's Fremont. So these identifying factors show that you're dealing with the Fremont cultural complex. Just real quick, 2 years ago, I was down at Fremont Indian State Park running a star party. I was on the board of the Utah Valley Astronomy Club. And look, while I was there, I was 3 days, gave lectures, did star parties during the nights. During the days, I took my son and we just walked the trails through the canyon and looked at, you know, hundreds of petroglyphs. Clear Creek Canyon, where this is located at, has almost 3,200 petroglyphs carved into the one canyon.
Wow.
It's one of the most dense conglomerations of rock art in the Southwest. And so, you know, I should tell you real quick how they found this settlement. In 1984, they were building Interstate 70 through this canyon. And there's this massive hill that was scheduled to be demolished because the hill was silty and they were going to use that silt and dirt for the road base of the highway. So the bulldozers started to plow in to dismantle the hill, and of course they ran into what turns out to be the largest Fremont settlement yet discovered. A large settlement that was built on this hill. Now, this is going to shock most people listening, but in 1984, the rules for preserving archaeological sites had not been codified. And so, because there were millions of dollars at stake, basically they gave archaeologists 60 days to record what they could record, and then they did demolish the hill. And
wow.
Yep, that Fremont Village is now road base of Interstate 7.
Oh, come on.
So that's horrific. But the upside is it actually created a national stir. I don't know if you're around in the 1980s, but as a result of that, the state of Utah made a heritage park, Fremont Indian State Park.
Okay.
There's a museum there, a full-time staff and curator. And as a result, they've actually been able to preserve more than would have been preserved. And so that's the silver lining in that story. We lost the village. And but again, I'm going to show you in a couple slides here. My partner and I 3 weeks ago discovered a new rock shrine that's not in any report. And so there's a lot of stuff there that just still hasn't been found or looked for. And so
it's never ending. I mean, I think we're going to keep finding new things every day. But let's see these. These look great. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to show 3 panels tonight. I don't know how much time we have. You might have to edit this conversation.
We'll figure it out.
All right. So here's one of the panels. Actually, this is the panel that really changed the way I looked at the Fremont petroglyphs, because I was hiking. Most of the petroglyphs, almost all the petroglyphs, are of animals: sheep, deer, elk. Then there are tons of anthropomorphic figures, deities, and human figures. And then you get some, like some plant motifs and stuff like that. So my son and I were hiking through the canyon, looking at hundreds of these things. And we hike up to this petroglyph right here. And this was just radically different than everything we had seen, because it's just this large geometric shape. It's about 7 feet wide. Do you see my red dot there?
That's big.
And it's anchored with this wheel motif, has a series of 37 counting dots. And there's like a corn stalk. I don't know if you can see that, but there's independent motifs running all through it. And then there are these holes. I'll get another picture, but you see that big depression right in the middle? There's 2 other depressions.
Center of the wheel, or
right.
Yeah.
Well, I walk up to this thing, and I go, wow, that is different than everything else I've seen. And so I start counting the wedges, and gotta move this down.
Oh, interesting.
There are 12 wedges, and this wedge here has 11 lines in it. Now, look, I'm here 3 minutes, right? My first petroglyph experience, and I'm like, 12 wedges, 1 wedge has 11 lines. Now, I just so happen to know that the difference between 12 synodic lunar months and 1 solar year is 11 days.
Oh, wow.
And so I walk up and I count the 12 wedges and I count the 11 lines, and the hair on the back of my neck stands up.
Yeah.
And I say, is this a solar lunar count? Are they reconciling a lunar year with a solar year?
Oh my God.
And so now here's the other thing, a stroke of great luck. I walked up and I counted that, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. I wonder if that is what they're doing. And I stepped back just to look at the whole thing, and that's when I noticed this. So do you see the shadow and the sunlight here?
Yep.
Right on the bottom left image. Well, it turns out there's this little rock bulge above the petroglyph, and as the sun rises in the sky, the entire petroglyph is covered in shadow. And as it hits the zenith, the shadow starts to recede from the ground up, and what you get is this triangle of light coming up from the ground and going up into the petroglyph.
Oh, wow.
The tip of that triangular shaft of light actually hits that dot, comes up, hits that dot, comes up and hits that dot, which means they carved this entire section here in accordance with the sunlight shadow.
That's not an easy feat. Right off the bat there, that's incredible, right?
Well, that is incredible. But what's really incredible is this happens. It takes 2 hours for the phenomenon to happen. After 2 hours, the entire petroglyph is in sunlight. Okay. Had I been there an hour earlier or an hour later, I would have missed it.
Right.
Right. I would have walked up. I would have counted the wedges in the lines, and I said, "Man, that would have been, that might be a solar lunar count." But then I started to look, and I saw the sunlight move through across the petroglyph, and I'm like, "Oh my God, they're using the sunlight as part of the petroglyphic design."
Unreal.
And so, as a matter of fact, so here you see this is an infrared image of the, and it draws out some of the more contrast. So you can see the two pect holes here and the deep pect hole here. This hole up here, you see the bottom right?
Yeah.
The hole up there is different than these other ones. Those other ones have been pecked in using a rock, so they've hammered out the hole. That top one, they used an antler, a bone, or a stick, and they drilled it.
Oh.
So there's it was a small hole, had striations in it, but it was part of the petroglyph because it's the last thing the sun dagger hits. In my photograph here, is that a big enough image? Can you see the sunlight hitting that?
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't figure out what that was. It took me about 6 months to go, "Oh, you idiot, of course." So here's the rock face. I've got a 3/4 inch wooden dowel.
Interesting.
And I put it in there, and sure enough, that casts a shadow that moves across the petroglyph. And of course, on the day of equinox, that shadow goes right through that center hole when the sun reaches its zenith. So, of course, it goes through that center hole on other days of the year, but when the sun reaches its zenith, that happens on equinox.
And just for our listeners and myself, what's the zenith, the definition of that again?
High in the sky, noon.
Like high noon, like it's high.
Yeah, straight up in the sky.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, and so when you see the sun straight up in the sky, what you want to do is you want to look at these sun shadow effects at the same time of day on different days, because they're different on different days.
Of course.
And so so the bottom line is this petroglyph, whatever it is a solar lunar count. The sun dagger that goes through it starts in the summer months, apexes at summer solstice, recedes after that. So it's predicting summer solstice. And then this little hole is used as a gnomon stick, a sundial, to predict other seasons of the year, right? So
wow.
From equinox to solstice. Now the sun is too far south. From fall equinox to winter solstice, the petroglyph is completely in sunlight the whole time. So this petroglyph is being used basically from equinox to summer solstice. And that's, of course, the growing season. And so it's an agrarian calendar and a mythological, it's a cosmograph.
Right, because it seems like with the ancients, it does seem like a lot of things were multi-purpose, right? So this would be, used for crops, obviously, but,
crops, hunting,
mythological,
religious.
Right.
They all belong to the same. Only literate minds divide all that out. They don't.
Right.
Right? So when you plant a corn seed, you offer a prayer because the seed itself, belongs to a deity who helped create the earth, and so you offer a creation prayer that's part of your creation mythology, but it's also part of your growing season, right? And so there's all this overlap there.
All interconnected. Right. Yeah.
All right, so that's the sun wheel petroglyph.
Okay.
I'm going to move on to a different petroglyphic panel. It's this guy right here, sheep spiral. We've named these petroglyphs. The last one, sun wheel, because of that big wheel motif. Mm-hmm. This one because we have this gorgeous, large, rectangular ram with a spiral emerging out of its back. Now, I have a research partner. His name's John McHugh. I'm John Lundwall. He's John McHugh. He's a registered archaeologist with the state of Utah. So he's the archaeologist of the pair. I'm the astronomer of the pair. And together we do archeoastronomy.
Wow.
This panel is on the southwest end of the canyon, and it's actually not easy to get to. It's on a precarious path. You've seen me. I'm a big guy, right? This is a precarious path up on a ledge.
Interesting.
You know, some places, if you step off that ledge, you're not going to have a good day.
Interesting.
And
so does that also say something? Because I agree. Sometimes you find these things and you find these petroglyphs in places where you're like, well, who would even come up here? But maybe that's because two reasons. One, there is a specific purpose. Maybe there's a particular energy that they're aware of that we're not aware of in these areas, or it's the geology has actually shifted since them carving it, perhaps. I don't know.
Well, all of the above. There is a lot of erosion. There's a lot of rock. I mean, you can find petroglyphs on the ground, and they weren't carved on the ground. They were carved on the cliff face, and it's just all falling off. Also, the Fremont, they're little people, 4'10", 5 foot, right? Okay. They climbed everything, right? The small people, the low center, they're all Jackie Chans.
Well, and they're all like, and back then they all were Jackie Chan because they're all probably in so much better shape than we are today.
Oh, well, yeah, but their average lifespan was 40 years. So,
trade off. But quick question.
Toil, yeah.
Yeah, quick question with the petroglyphs now. How would they make these? Because these have spanned now sometimes hundreds, but if not thousands of years. How would they carve these in the first place?
Okay, so this rock face in this canyon is volcanic tuff. It's actually a chalky, soft rock, so it's pretty easy to carve into. The disadvantage is it erodes pretty quickly as well.
Right.
Look, in another 300-400 years, there's not going to be any left. Okay.
So, and that's probably because it's more of a recent carving, you think?
Well, so most of these were probably, the Fremont, they inhabit the canyon, earliest 500 maybe, maybe 300 CE, but they're big. The biggest settlement was between 9 and 1200. Again, that was during that warming season. So, and when I say the biggest settlement, there's about 100 people living there. That's it. Okay. Yeah, so before that, what was the dynamic? We're not sure. It's probably 50 people living there. And they may be semi-nomadic. They might come and stay here in the canyon for the summer months and then migrate out during the winter months.
Right.
And so, so the majority of these petroglyphs are probably carved, very earliest 500, but most of them between 9 and 1200. Okay. Now, some of them predate the Fremont. So
interesting.
Some of them are going back much earlier than that. In Utah, you can find petroglyphs that go back, into the 4th millennium BCE.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So,
wow.
In fact, there's a little cave in this canyon. It's not part of tonight's presentation, though it is the coolest thing there. But it's its own presentation. So I think
we'll have to follow up and do another one. There's so much to discuss.
Just real quickly, the archaeologists who surveyed the canyon dug 6 feet into the subsurface of that cave, and they found several layers of ash. Hearth ash, fire campfires, right? Dating back to 3500 BCE. Wow. So people have been going through this canyon using that cave as a cave shelter from 3500 BC. The last layer of campfire ash was 500 CE, 500 AD, and that's when the Fremont took over. So they came in and they stopped using that cave as a cave shelter, and they started using it for something else. And the interior of the cave is covered with petroglyphs, and they are very interesting. In fact, I've seen thousands of petroglyphs through Utah. That cave is one of the most unique sites I've ever seen. One of 2 sites that are jaw-dropping in ancient Fremont archaeology in the state of Utah. So, Yes.
We'll have to check that out for sure on another time. But I've just been staring at these spiral shapes because in my mind, and we'll get into it. I'll let you go, and I'll probably have a couple of questions. But these are some interesting shapes.
They are interesting shapes, but I'm not going to talk about the shapes. The shapes are interesting, and I have a YouTube video about them. So
we'll link it in the description below.
Type in my name on YouTube, and you can watch it.
Oh yeah.
What I want to show you is something else. So there's actually over here to the right of the screen, there's this corner that you have to crawl around as you hike that little ledge up on this bluff. And we turn that corner right when the sunlight and that shadow line was falling down this rock. And so we returned on summer solstice to get a time-lapse video of it, so I'll just play it. Takes about 2 hours for all of that to happen. And it may not seem like much, and in fact, everyone who's ever walked by it has never thought 2 seconds about it. But when we turn the corner, again, this happens 2 hours a day during the summer months. Had we been there an hour earlier, an hour later, an hour earlier, it would have all been in shadow. An hour later, it all would have been in sunlight. We wouldn't have seen anything. We wouldn't have noticed anything. We would have moved on. So we were there right at the right moment. And what moment was that? Well, do you see this little guy right here? He's right here. He's a little anthropomorph. He's a little deity. Don't know who he is or what they call him.
Oh, I see. It's like a inverse sort of triangular body with
that's his trapezoidal torso. He's got little legs down here, little arms. He has these two little lines coming off his head. Those are feathers. So he's wearing a feather headdress, and they're pointing, towards the spiral. Well, look what happens when the sunlight descends upon this rock face. The sun shadow line goes right between those feathers, touches the edge of the 12 spirals, and bisects the spiral on the back of the sheep. I've got it lined out right here in blue. Right?
Real.
And then if you keep watching, the sunlight shadow line goes right through the middle of the spiral and goes right between these two sheep are connected. It's going right between the nose and the butt of the two sheep, and it comes up and it bisects the circular glyph above.
Unreal.
So it takes about 30 minutes for the sun shadow line to go through these petroglyphs.
And these are perfect. Yeah, these go perfectly through this. I'm just looking at these are perfectly through the center of the major large circular shape and then that smaller one at the top. I mean, like you couldn't have it more precise.
Well, so here's what they're doing.
Wow.
And this is a discovery to us. They are using that sun shadow line as their template to carve the images in size and proportion on the rock face. So in other words, before they carve anything, they watch how the sun shadow line moves across it. Then they'll probably chalk things in before they carve it to make sure that it's lined up, right? So the previous glyph, here we have this little guy down here. The sun shadow line goes through his feathers, touches the edge, bisects that spiral, goes through the spiral, goes between these. They actually use these natural fissures in the rock as part of the design.
Unreal.
So they don't carve into them. But the bottom line is we watched that a couple days in a row and realized that they have carved, they don't just randomly carve rock art on the rock face. They watch that sun shadow line and then they use that to carve the image on the rock face. So what are they doing? They're analogizing the image with the power of the sun and cosmos. Wow. Right? Now they are living images. It's a methodology. The image itself is imbued with power from the cosmos because it's lined up with the cosmos. This is the most basic form of archaeoastronomy. So that's just mind-blowing. There's a tradition that these images were living and breathing to the people who created them, and we just think that's superstition and magic. But literally, this is how they live and breathe. They've lined them up with the sun shadow lines that move across them.
Well, and what you're seeing here is, so it happens all over the world with these ancient sites, like we experience in Egypt, for example, where the architecture there is designed. Now it's far more grandiose and not as necessarily, if you want to call it, crude, like we have here on a rock face, but it's the same kind of idea where they're not only aligning it to different astronomical alignments, but it really is built to interact with the sun, to interact with these cosmic entities, and to, I guess, bring heaven to earth, so to speak, or to bring the cosmos to earth. And you see this in China, you see it in, like, Angkor Wat, in Cambodia. You see this obviously all over South America. And it's just interesting that this was not just something you see in the Utah desert, for example. This is worldwide, but done in different kind of ways, right?
Done in different ways, worldwide. We had no idea this was happening here, and most people still don't. Our journal article hasn't been published yet. So, so look, there's almost 3,200 petroglyphs in this canyon, and I can't say that all of them follow this methodology because I haven't looked at all of them. Right. So I've looked at 4 panels, and they do follow that methodology. But these panels stick out, so they might be special. But the other thing is, Chris, is that the sun shadow lines change over the year because the angle of the sun changes in the sky over the year. It's lower in the sky during the winter, higher in the sky during summer.
Right.
And what that means is, if they don't exactly line up in the summer, which is where we spend most of our time in the canyon, because that's when we have most of our time to spend.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that they're not lining up on some other part of the year, right?
Right.
And so in order to really track this down, you have to live there, which is what they did. They lived there. Now, the other question is, are any of these lined up to moonlight? Because the light of the full moon casts these same shadows.
Interesting.
Dark shadows and moon shadow lines. And so that is another thing that, if we ever get talking about that cave, I'll talk about lunar petroglyphs and possibilities. All right, so this is this was quite exciting to discover that there's a real methodology, and they're analogizing at least some of their petroglyphs to the power of the sun. They were doing the same thing with the sunwheel petroglyph, with that triangle of light coming up through it. That is the same thing. They're making that petroglyph a living image of the cosmos.
Yeah, it really does come to life with those shadows. Now, I know you didn't want to comment on this, but I gotta say, on that past slide there with those, what do you make of the spiral shapes? I mean, obviously for me, it's spiral galaxy, could even be a vortex in water, could be whatever, right? What do you make of that?
Most southwestern petroglyph spirals relate to timekeeping. And if you're keeping time, you're tracking celestial cycles. So, that is a spiral. The line starts here. Do you see how it meanders into the sheep?
Mm-hmm.
It starts here, and then it goes to 12 revolutions to the center, and yet it's divided into 9 wedges. So those are interesting numbers. Again, 12 lunar months. What's shocking is to track the moon through its entire cycle requires 18.6 years.
Okay.
And so if basically just over 9 years one direction, just over 9 years another direction, I've got 12 spirals divided into 9 wedges. My initial estimate is they're tracking the lunar cycle through its entire 18.6 year
oh my God.
Cycle. If that is the case, then this is the only other site we know of petroglyphs tracking that other than Chaco Canyon. So again, that's
Wow.
I have some pretty good circumstantial evidence to boost that argument, one of which is a pendant that was found in one of the pit houses, which has lunar motifs on it, including all the numbers that you need to track that 18.6 year lunar cycle.
Okay.
So it's a lunar pendant, and it has 13. I mean, again, maybe we'll do that on another
future episode. That's fascinating.
But so when you find that, in fact, actually, after I found that, it was in a box in the back of the museum. You know, it's hidden away collecting dust.
Classic.
And my research partner saw a picture of it in one of the archaeology studies, and he said, "What do you make of that?" And I said, "Oh, crap. That's the
Unreal.
lunar cycle. That's the entire lunar cycle." So we had the museum curator, Amy Ramsland Larson, find it, and she got it out. And I actually measured it, took photographs of it, and then had a friend of mine 3D print it. So I have an exact duplicate of it that I use in the field.
Very cool.
So
wow.
Anyway, so these spirals are probably connected to the solar and lunar cycles. There could be planetary or stellar tracking going in there. The problem is we just don't know Fremont cosmology, so we didn't know. We don't know what to look at. So we're limited to what can we at least circumstantially prove, and that's solar lunar cycle. So that's
still a lot right there. Yeah. Wow.
Well, wait till I show you the next one. All right, how are we doing on time?
We're doing great. Yeah,
one more.
We're doing fine. Let's keep going. This is great.
This is the last panel that I wanted to show you.
Perfect.
Again, we named this ourselves. It's the official name is a bunch of letters and numbers. So this is the dual sun petroglyph, and you can see here. Do you see that sun?
Yeah.
Image, and there is another one interlocked with it. It's very faint. Do you see it?
I do. Yeah.
Right below it is a crescent moon. Do you see that?
Oh wow.
So it's two interlocking suns with a crescent moon. So my research partner, John McHugh, what he does is he just looks for the petroglyphs that are clearly astronomical. Suns, moons, and stars, right? So we don't have to guess at what a square sheep is. By the way, those big square sheep,
yeah,
those are symbols. Those aren't sheep. There are thousands, hundreds of sheep petroglyphs there. And there's a huge variety of them, different shapes and sizes. So they're representing things other than sheep.
Right. I was seeing lines, kind of almost some had a couple of more lines sticking out of them than others. And you're wondering, is that like,
Yeah, it has 7 loops on his tail, 4 spiral coming out of his back. His nose is touching a baby ram who's connected to a field with 3 loops. These are all cosmological motifs.
Yeah, very symbolic. And for any of our listeners right now who aren't watching this on YouTube, one of the body we're just sort of talking about here, actually to me just jumped out. Like it actually looks like an old piece of film that you would have used, for either for photography or for film. You know what I mean? Like you see how the left side's got the kind of the holes almost in that. Either way, I mean, it's a very odd looking shape to depict an animal. And as you said, it's probably just layered with symbolism as it seems to be right now. It's amazing.
Well, for all we know, it could be like a mat, a rug that the Fremont make, and they perform a ritual on it. So they've just carved it right up on the rock face, and it becomes their sheep. And I think it's tied into their creation narrative because the 7, 12, 9, those are all solar lunar numbers. So, what does it mean exactly? I can't tell you. No one can. But I can tell you it's lined up with the sun shadow line. And then some of the numbers are really interesting. So,
yeah. Fascinating.
All right, so here we have the dual sun petroglyph, 2 suns and a crescent moon.
Mm-hmm.
Truth of the matter is, this was in the archaeology report, and we were trying to find it. I couldn't find it. My partner found it when I wasn't down in the canyon. And there's this crack. Do you see? You actually can see it in this image. There's this crack in the rock on the left, right there.
Yeah.
And right on the ground from that crack was this little guy right here.
It's so black, kind of.
It's a corn cob. It's a 3-inch corn cob.
Oh.
Now the Fremont corn it's Fremont dent, and they're 3 or 4 inch corn cobs. They're not the big corn cobs we're used to. They're these little guys.
Okay.
So that is probably an ancient corn cob. Now, how did it get there? How long has it been there? Did a pack rat bring it in? Did it fall out of that crack? Was that crack used for offerings?
Yeah.
We are, we don't know, but he walked up, looked down. He's done archaeology in Utah and in the Southwest, so he immediately recognized it as Fremont Dent. Though
Wow.
to confirm it, we are actually having it carbon dated. So,
I was about to ask that.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we're having it carbon dated. That takes,
Wow.
we don't. This study isn't part of a big university, federally funded, a grant, so it takes us months to get the data back.
That's fair enough.
So I'll tell you when it comes back, but we are
Please
getting
do.
it carbon dated. So the first thing is we find the sun and moon petroglyph, and we find this old corn cob that's very interesting. The museum curator tagged it and took it. Now, before I start explaining this this petroglyph, I just want to explain to you and your audience, if people don't know, that the sun moves across the horizon through the year. A lot of people don't know this, but if you go out every morning and watch the sunrise, the sun does not rise in the same spot every day. It moves a little bit. Okay, and so here I am standing atop what's left of Five Finger Ridge. That's that hill that they tore down and made the interstate that you can see.
Oh, okay.
So here I am standing on what's left of that hill looking east, and I've pointed out on the horizon where the winter solstice sunrise occurs, where the summer solstice sunrise occurs, and right in the middle, the equinox sunrise. So I've tracked this cycle back and forth, and so did they. They watched, because where the sun rises on the horizon will give you your dates, right? They don't have calendars and smartwatches. They're keeping their calendar by watching the sun and moon move across the horizon.
Right.
And so this becomes very important in my next slide. But just so you know, this is how it works. The sun in its southernmost position at winter solstice will rise in the south. Then it stays still for a couple days and then starts rising north until it gets to its northernmost position at summer solstice, stays still for a couple days and starts going south, and back and forth every year. It does that. And what the sun does in a year, the moon does in a month. So the moon does the same thing, going back and forth on the horizon, but instead of taking 365 days to do it, it does it every month, every 28 days, basically.
Right. Interesting.
With the exception is that the moon has an additional cycle to it, which I'm not going to get into. All right, so now that you know that, we know that, for example, the Hopi. Have you heard of the Hopi?
Oh, yeah.
Indians?
Yeah, actually, but just for our audience, where are they located in the U.S.?
Yeah, Southwest. So, that's New Mexico, Arizona.
Okay.
Southwest. And they're after the Fremont. So, if the Fremont are associated with the Southwest Cultural Complex, they're sort of the ancestors to the Hopi, right? The Fremont, the Anasazi. So there's, Hopi and Zuni and actually dozens of tribes. But we know from the ethnographic data, just reading, anthropology and ethnography reports, that the Hopi have a sun priest. Every tribe has a sun priest. And the sun priest will sit in the sun shrine and he'll watch that sun move across the horizon. Okay? And he's the person in charge of saying, it's summer solstice, time to perform our ceremony. It's equinox, time to perform our ceremony. It's right between equinox and solstice, time to perform our ceremony. Right? They have different ritual days that don't just fall on the solstices and equinoxes. They fall throughout the year. Some of them are tied to the agriculture. Some of them are lunar. Some of so there's a wide variety of them. But they have at least one person, the sun priest, who keeps the days. And if you are a bad sun priest, if you're off a couple of years in a row, it's not good for you. They cancel your 401k. So, which is the house you live in. So,
right.
So the sun priest then will watch the sun move across the horizon. But the other thing they do, let me pull that image back up. is if I were, so it's specific to your location, right? So if right here, I'm standing on top of a ridge. If I move somewhere else, the horizon is going to change.
Yeah.
And so you have to create a spot from which to watch. And then that's where you keep, and turns out they had multiple spots. They'd sit in one spot and watch for the sun to rise in like a particular notch on the horizon from that spot. And they'll say, now's the day, because there's a particular notch. Another thing they would do is they would watch the sun move across the horizon, and on the horizon, they would go out and, like on the top of these bluffs, they would build little shrines, little rock cairns, piles of rocks or something, and they would send a sun runner out, and they would deposit a prayer feather or an offering or a pot at the shrine, and that helps the sun keep moving, right? They're analogically participating in the cosmos. So if you keep your prayers and rituals going, the sun's going to keep going.
I see.
And if the sun keeps going, your tribe's going to keep going, right? So there's this symbiotic relationship that's happening. The other thing that's happening is the sun runner who runs out there, and boy, that's a long, crappy run. That guy's not having a good day. He's like training to be the next sun priest. And so when the old sun priest retires, he says, remember all those shrines that you offer those offerings at? That's where you look for the sun when you sit here and do. So it's a form of memory training.
Interesting.
Okay? So we had a theory, and the theory was, did the Fremont do the same thing that the Hopi did? And of course, we had no idea, but in order to test the theory, we wanted to identify what we thought could be a possible sun shrine where a priest sat and watched the sun across the horizon on significant days. And then we wanted to hike the opposing bluff on the horizon to see if we could find any cairns or, any kind of rock shrine. Could they have done anything similar? So here we are at this petroglyph panel, and our theory is this panel. Let's see what my next slide is. Yeah, okay. So this panel, do you see the two suns right here?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and there's the little crescent moon right below it.
Okay.
About 30 feet above the roadway. I'm facing east as I'm taking this picture. But if I put my back against this rock, it faces southwest towards this bluff here in the upper left.
Okay.
In fact, it faces directly to the winter solstice sunset, sunsetting in the west. In fact, the winter solstice sun comes down here at the sky, and do you see this little dip in that horizon?
Yep.
It sets just to the right of the center of that dip.
So we are standing here, and our theory is, well, if they did anything, we would have to hike to the top of this bluff at that location to see if we could find anything. So we started here, took a compass bearing. We know where the winter solstice sunset is occurring. And then, of course, that bluff's a couple miles away, and it doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't look like much, but it's not an easy hike.
It's dense, though, yeah.
And that's why we've been putting off the hike for a long time. We've had this theory for a while, but we've
got to put the legwork in.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. Also, you know, it's centuries old, and what ideally what I was looking for is a pile of rocks,
Right.
a rock cairn. And after centuries, what are the chances of that's, you know, still there?
Slim to
After
none.
all the erosion and the wind and the dust and people and
Of course.
cows, because sometimes cows graze, you know. So we didn't expect to find anything. This is just checking things off our list. Let's test the theory. We have a theory. Maybe we'll find something.
Right.
Maybe we won't.
Right.
So we go, we take our compass bearing. Oh, and Chris.
Yeah.
We don't, you know, there's like maybe 200 yards back and forth that we have to search all along that bluff. That's a lot of ground to cover.
Yes.
And so, you know, it's 95 degrees. It just sounds miserable. But we take our compass bearing, we hike out there, and we don't have to hike. We hike right into, without looking, we're just following our compass. We hike right into this.
All right. So,
Oh my God.
no, that's what I said. Oh my God. What the mother fork spoon? So, so, this is not in any archaeology report I've read. And so this really shocked us. First off, it looks too put together and new to be centuries old.
It does. That
Yeah, it
really
does.
jumped out to me. I'm like, when was this made?
Yeah.
Like a couple of years
Yeah.
ago?
So we hiked up, we hiked right into this, and we stood there probably for 5 minutes, just silent. We're like, what do we do with this?
Kind of a cosmic coincidence, yeah.
Right. And the guy there, that's my partner, John Q. We both say, boy, that looks too new and too well preserved to be centuries old. So then we go in and we start looking at it. Well, so here's what we find. That ring of stones around the monolithic boulder has lichen growing on it to the subsurface of the dirt, which means that stone ring was placed before the lichen grew on the rocks.
Oh, wow.
So that dates this ring of stones, it's hard to say, decades, maybe a century, could be 2 centuries old.
Okay.
Okay. So that doesn't place it at Fremont, but it could, after the Fremont leave in the 14th century, the Navajo and Ute come in. So it could be later Navajo Ute, or actually when we first looked at it, we said that's probably a neo-pagan shrine, and some hippie in the 60s came and did this, right? But the second thing we found as we walked into the stone rings, ring of stone, is we found at least a dozen obsidian flakes. Now, obsidian is not natural to the canyon, so that identifies it as a Native American site. Who is going to chip obsidian here, right? After that hike.
Yeah.
Only the Native Americans are going to be chipping obsidian. So the obsidian flakes, we also found some rocks that are flaked to use as stone tools.
Okay.
Okay, so there's obsidian and rock chert within the stone ring. So that gets us really excited.
Yeah.
Right? Because that puts us into Native American culture. The third thing we find is there's this little opening right here in the stone ring.
Yeah.
Well, if you stand there and you face out into that opening, from this position, it's facing southeast, and there's this clearing on the bluff, and that is where winter solstice sunrise occurs. So that is really encouraging. So now we're thinking, if this were made by modern people, well, they had to replace it before the lichen growth. They had to come and chip obsidian within the ring, and they had to know where winter solstice sunrise was in order to line up the ring, right? So the other thing is this flat part of the boulder has been bowled out, and we didn't touch anything. So this is, in that bowl is a bunch of seeds, and then there is a modern terracotta plate that's put on it, and the plate is full of glass beads. So someone has been coming and using it as an offering shrine. We could not, this is all grown over with lichen, and so we could not determine, the lichen's very old, we could not determine if that depression in the boulder had been pounded out. You could see chips, because it's all covered in growth. We would have to scrape that off, and we don't touch anything.
If it got chipped out originally though, and then the growth came.
We wanted to know if that was man-made, that depression, that bowl in the boulder.
Right.
Right? Because if it's man-made, that would be centuries old, and that would be an offering shrine. So our actually, this is the only monolithic boulder within 300 yards, all the way up and down that bluff. So our initial theory is this was an offering shrine. They left the offerings in this bowl. This ring of stones probably came later by Navajo or Ute.
Okay. How big is that monolith? What do you call it? Sorry, the
It's a monolithic boulder.
monolithic boulder.
Yeah,
How big is that?
It's as tall as me, 6'4".
Okay.
So,
And I mean,
and as wide as me. Thank God I'm not as wide. What are you saying, Chris?
give yourself some credit,
saying?
John. No, I mean, I'm just curious because, like you're saying, how it aligns so perfectly. Is that boulder in its original, place, or did it get moved there somehow? Or
No, I think it is in its original place.
interesting.
I do.
Hmm.
So I think that's just fortuitous. That cave that maybe we'll talk about one day,
Mm-hmm.
it hasn't been altered. It's just a natural cave.
Right.
And it just so happens, it just by an extraordinary coincidence of nature, as you sit in that cave and look out, it frames the ecliptic, the sun, and the moon perfectly.
Wow.
You can keep a stellar solar lunar calendar just in that cave.
Unreal.
And so I've got all these graphics that you can look at, but they didn't do that. They noticed, oh my gosh, this is the place to watch the sky.
Right.
And that's why they stopped building campfires in it and carved their petroglyphs and used it as an observatory.
Right.
So anyway, here we walked into this. Now, look, this far exceeded our expectations. We still don't know quite what to do with it, but it's not in any of the archaeology reports. No one's hyped that bluff apparently. And it's just kind of cool that you have a predictive theory, you follow that theory, and you find something that your theory says you will find, right?
Right, right.
So that's kind of cool. However, this is about 200 yards from the very top of the bluff.
Okay.
And so what we did is we stayed here for a couple hours. What we wanted to find was some sort of diagnostic arrowhead or pottery shard. If we could find some grayware pottery somewhere around this, that would date it to Fremont.
Okay.
Right? But we looked, and we don't do any digging. You have to have permits, so we don't touch anything. We just look at the surface.
Yeah.
We couldn't find. We found the obsidian and the chert, but we could not find any pottery shards. Any arrowheads will be designed, and so we didn't find any arrowheads. So our next step here is actually to get permission to do some digging. And
Great.
Sift through the dirt and see if we can find something.
Fantastic.
But we kept walking that line to the very top of the bluff, and this is what we found. Now, that doesn't look like much. You're like, what are you doing? Are you smoking pot? But actually,
Pile of rocks.
that's what I expected to find. If I were to find anything, it's a pile of rocks. It's a disheveled pile of rocks.
Mm-hmm.
But how is that any different than any other pile of rocks? One, there is no other pile of rocks up on that bluff. There are a lot of rocks, and there's slate, and there's sedimentary, there's volcanic rock, there's chips of granite. All these rocks are volcanic rocks, right? They've all been put in a pile. And we found obsidian and chert in the pile.
Okay.
So again, this is a site where Native Americans were chipping. And that's the same line, same compass bearing at the very top. Our theory so far is that right here is the original shrine. That's a Fremont shrine, centuries old, where they left their offerings. And that other one, we still don't know what to do with it because it's so spectacular. And we're like, come on, no one's seen this? What? So we don't, again, we want to dig and see if we can find any diagnostic.
Oh, that's amazing.
So,
wow. That's incredible. That's really incredible.
So that's that. Those are my three panels. That's an overview of some of the petroglyphs I'm looking at Clear Creek Canyon. You can follow my work on my website, johnlundwall.com. And I have a YouTube site just under my name. You can watch.
And for our audience listening, we're gonna get all of John's. I'm gonna talk with John after this podcast and get all of his information. So just take a look in the description below this video for everything, including John's website, YouTube page, and other things that we'll discuss that John wants to give to you guys to check out, because his research is obviously ongoing, as you can see, and it's absolutely fascinating. and some place where we just don't think that these types of things would happen. I mean, just the sheer volume of petroglyphs, I had no idea existed there in Utah. I mean, that's news to me, let alone all the discoveries you just mentioned. When we were talking offline, John, we were talking about, of course, our time in Egypt together, and you said you had a couple of photos. I would love to show our audience some of those photos from Egypt, and of course, like everything we've been talking about on this episode today about archaeoastronomy, it's no different in Egypt. They were so aware of the cosmos and, of course, built and aligned their buildings to these. Once again, we have theories and ideas as to why, but ultimately, it's still a bit of a mystery because this was so important to them. And in today's day and age, we don't care at all about it. So our level, the consciousness of the human beings that were building it at the time, very different than today. So what do you got from Egypt?
Yeah, I've got one thing I want to throw in before I hit my Egypt pictures. Hope you don't mind. Maybe we can squeeze it in somewhere. But I'm advertising a tour I'm leading next year through the ancient sites of Britain and Wales. That's May 31st through June 13th. And we'll be doing all that we're talking about, but we'll be doing it at the ancient sites in Britain and Wales, Avebury, Stonehenge, Uffington, Glastonbury, Salisbury. So just fantastic sites. We'll be talking about the ancient Grail mythology, which is actually really interesting. Goes back into pre-Christian Egyptian Greco traditions. And so anyway, I just wanted to plug that. If you're interested, you can, again, my Facebook, my website. And the cost is pretty reasonable.
It's quite reasonable. And before we get into Egypt here, just to add on to that for our audience, these are the way, if you're interested and you're watching this podcast, chances are you're interested in this stuff. And when you go to these sites in person, as myself and of course John have done, it hits you in a way that this podcast and any video you watch on YouTube will never do, because as we've been describing this entire episode, these are experiential places. These are places that are not just something you can look at in a two-dimensional or even the three-dimensional type of way. They're an experience all unto themselves, and there's something very powerful when you go to these places anywhere in the world. Of course, all over Great Britain, there's so many amazing sites. And it's when you go with somebody like John, who has all this amazing knowledge, and obviously knowledge that's a little bit different than what you're going to get on a very typical tourist type of tour, you not only expand your mind intellectually, but you really expand yourself on a spiritual, physical, mental, emotional kind of way. And these are trips that have changed my life personally. So again, highly recommended to the audience watching. These are the kind of trips you want to hop on if you want a real experience. So absolutely, like I said, we'll have these in the description below. You can check them out. And to conclude, I guess, the things here, let's talk about Egypt for a bit. So yeah, what do you got there? I saw a beautiful photo you had pulled up.
Just to tag that, one of the greatest things a person can do is travel. Because they are experiential. You can't, sadly, when I'm down there in Clear Creek Canyon, I quickly realized in order to learn what I need to learn, I have to be there. I can't just do it mathematically on an astronomy program. I have to see the horizon. I have to experience the site. I have to feel the field, feel the wind. It is an experiential research. People just don't get that because we live out of a cubicle. But you've been around the world. I've been around the world, and it's one of the best things a person can do. Let's pull up some Egypt pictures. I didn't want to spend too much time, but these are all pictures that I've taken. This is Abydos, and just again, the picture's kind of cool. I think the picture's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But the experience of it is jaw-dropping.
Yes.
Right? Do you remember those temples walking through? The pillars just go up and up and up, and there's so many of them. And it is, it's walking into a temple or pyramid of ancient Egypt is like walking onto a different planet. You're confronted with a different world. And really, it's a remarkable stretch of the imagination to figure out what were they doing, what were they thinking,
right?
Let alone how in the hell did they do this?
Right? Why and how? Every question, and everyone I know who I've talked to since the Egypt trip, we all come back with more questions. No, not as many answers, but just more questions. It's jaw dropping. It's absolutely jaw dropping.
I pulled this up because if you remember, this is another shot I took, and you see these sun shafts going right down the middle?
Yeah.
They actually built holes in the ceiling and walls to capture the sunlight. Very similarly, they're analogizing the powers of the cosmos into their temple space. And some of those sun shafts hit the hieroglyphs. That's purposeful, right? So all this is, they're doing the same thing I just did, but it's, they're using it differently. But it's the same thing. They're capturing sunlight, perhaps moonlight, capturing it into their sacred space, analogizing the space, sometimes the hieroglyphs, with that power, and that makes it come alive. And so it's the same sort of thing done slightly differently.
It's like it activates it. It's almost like it's an odd type of technology that we've completely forgotten about, almost like a stone-based cosmological technology that they would be designing these things. Is it just because it looks nice when a beam of light? Yeah, I mean it does, but there's obviously more of a purpose. And this is a bit of a weird tangent, but when I'm walking through those temples, I kept imagining like I was a small little insect inside like a computer chip, because you see those computer chips and they're actually got the pillars, and then they've sometimes got those flat tops for maybe like not a motherboard, but things like this, where you look at a computer chip and a macro, and I wish I had the photo to pull up here, but anyway, you look at a temple and they're very, very oddly similarly built. Now I don't know if there's any correlation there, but it feels like maybe not a device, but these temples are activated by the cosmos and the sun and the position at the time of the day and all these types of things. Plus, I think the people are also a part of that process too.
Well, a lot of these temples are, they're designed with specific geometries. Just the mathematical ratios involved line them up like the sun shadow line on those Fremont petroglyphs. A lot of the ratios in Egyptian temples and Near Eastern temples follow the harmonic scale. And so they're analogizing the power of, music is a mystery of the cosmos, just like the sun, moon, and stars is. And so they used musicality as, there's an interesting book by Ernest McLean. He's a musicologist. He teaches music theory at a university. The Myth of Invariance is the name of his book, 1970s, I think. And he just so happened to notice one day as he was flipping through a coffee table book that the pantheon of the ancient Near East, so there's Anu and Ishtar, Inanna, right, Marduk, Shamash, the sun god. All of these deities have had numeric values associated with them. So he was looking at the pantheon and he was seeing the numeric values. And he was the first to notice that the head god Anu, which is the sky god, his number was 60. But it's a base 60 system, right? It's not a base 10 system. So in a base 60 system, 60 is a whole, a starting and ending point. It's 160, okay? So Anu is 60, and all the other deities, 20, 30, 40. If you divided the numbers of all the other deities into Anu, 60, you got all the ratios of the harmonic scale.
Wow.
So in our history books, the first person to have figured that out is supposed to be Pythagoras, the Greek, 600 BCE. In fact, almost every history of science book begins with Pythagoras. Here is the beginnings of science. They've sloughed off thousands of years of mythological thinking. Now we're actually reasoning and testing and measuring. And it begins with Pythagoras because he comes up with the numbers of the musical scale. And so he's divided it out and he's got it all mathematically done. Well, here this musicologist sees that the Babylonians had done that 1,000 years before Pythagoras, but they had encoded it in their myth and religion, right? And so, again, all that means is we simply do not understand ancient myth and religion because it had a technical aspect to it.
It did.
There are no blueprints of the Great Pyramid in Egypt. There are no technical diagrams, no mathematical formulas. All we ever get are mythological scenarios, right? Hunufu shows up, Sekhmet shows up, Thoth shows up. They have their little dancing sticks and their little rituals, and modern scholars make fun of that. But out of that religious complex appears the Great Pyramid, which means what? Which means something else is going on behind this mask of religion other than just religion. The Great Pyramid, the geometry, the mathematics, the cosmology, the harmony, all of that is part of that religious complex. And it doesn't get separated out until full literacy, which is where the Greeks come in. And so bottom line is people have been smart for a very long time. You walk into these structures and you do feel there is a sort of resonant harmony in them.
Yeah.
Because literally there is. Literally they've been built to ratios of the harmonic scale or even astronomical ratios or prime numbers or, you know, the golden mean. There's always something that they have used in order to build these structures.
These structures were encoded with mathematics and just in almost exploding with formulas and ratios. And I heard and I forget where this came from, but an individual was calling architecture frozen music, and how, yeah. Isn't that interesting? And
that is interesting.
I know, and I'm like, that is perfectly describes what I was experiencing in Egypt when I'm looking at these structures, where it was also a beauty that moved you like music moves you, but there was a communication happening like music communicates, but it doesn't have to have lyrics to communicate with you, but it can communicate very explicit and specific things. And these temples are just the same, but in a physical form, but same kind of vibrational mathematics.
We forget, Chris, that, you know, during the ritual cycle, these temples were filled literally with music. The people are transmitting their information not with texts. You know, these temple texts are for the priests and for the royalty, but how they're transmitting it is through chants, songs, and dances. That's the way they've been doing it for thousands of years. And so ancient myth was never a text. It was a song, dance, and chant. Right? Ancient Greek drama was sung. We just can't, you know, we can't comprehend that. But the chorus lines in all our ancient Greek dramas were literally sung by a chorus of priests that danced around an altar, and the actors just occupied a small part. The stage was teeny, and the choral space was huge, and that's where the chorus sung and danced. And most of the play was sung and danced. Well, that's just a different world, but that's this world that we're looking at. This world of temples and ancient cosmology is a world of music and harmony, dance, and song.
And just one last thought on that is they are resonant chambers. And when we were in the Great Pyramid, you know, we did some. Goodness. I know, right? Goodness. Yeah. Started doing some chants. My musician in me was just like going crazy with the acoustics in there. And we did a very, an amateur chant. You know, it wasn't like we had thought of this previously and had a whole plan. Like, obviously back in ancient Egypt, it would be very methodical. They'd have a whole way of doing things. We just chanted. And that alone was such a profound physical and emotional, spiritual experience when, you know, myself and I know a lot of others left the Great Pyramid. You can't articulate the feeling, but my God, were you affected by it in so many ways? I think I'm still coming to terms with now, you know, months and months later. So
I agree. The acoustics, particularly in the King's Chamber, but in every chamber, were, they took my breath away. I didn't expect that. And there's a vibration and a resonance that goes down into the bone. You know, it's like, right? My God, this is,
I know.
This is, it is, you know, sometimes I'll sit in a great cathedral and I'll listen to the choir sing. and I love it. It's a religious experience. Well, this is the cathedral of the ancient world, and it's designed for a chorus of priests or priestesses to do their rituals, and it transposes you to a different state, a different conscious state.
100%.
I that's just a fact. So I've experienced it. Let's see what else I got here.
Oh,
All right.
yeah.
Well, I really like that shot.
I love that shot. That's right at sunrise for our audience, I believe, right?
Right at sunrise. In
Yeah.
fact, the best time to take any photograph is sunrise, sunset. And so
Magic hour.
I was not very social when we were at the Sphinx, Chris, because I was running around taking as many pictures as I could to get the lighting the way I wanted it.
And so you should.
And the same was at Karnak. I left the group, and we were there at dusk, and I had 45 minutes to get the shots I wanted with the sky that I wanted. So I just wrote everyone off and ran around and took my photograph.
That's what you got to do. Yeah.
But of course, and this is one of the great reasons why, we went with Robert Schoch, and he has this theory. You see all the water erosion occurring in the Sphinx enclosure all around this guy. And boy, that is, that's just an enigma. And so good for Robert to bring this out. Of course, he's been decimated by many circles in academia. But bottom line is, there it is. It's actually not difficult geology. It's pretty simple to see.
Yeah.
And so, and then you're left with an anomaly. History gives us tons of anomalies.
Yes. Yeah.
Tons of them. And all that means is our picture of history is terribly incomplete. That's all that means.
Yep.
We're missing something. We're missing a couple pieces. And so how do we want to, look, ancient history is a 10,000 piece puzzle, and we have 100 pieces. No, but this is serious. Not 1,000 pieces, not 2,000 pieces. We have 100 pieces of a 10,000 piece puzzle. We always have to remind ourselves with that. And because we're missing so much, it's very easy for people just to make up crap.
Yep.
Right? And so they bring in the aliens, and they bring in the lizard people, and they bring in and then everyone's just a howling barbarian. And we have painted over prehistory mostly with projection, mostly with our own sense of self.
Yeah.
And so so I stand here in front of the Sphinx, and that's Khafre's pyramid, right? That's not the Great Pyramid. And it's experiential. You have to be there. The picture doesn't do it any justice. And you just realize the size of it, the magnificence of it. The head is totally undersized for the body, and you realize, my gosh, that's an afterthought. That if that hasn't been recarved, then I don't think the Egyptians would have done it.
And John, you bring up something that I think we came across every day in Egypt, which is that these sites, and we got to remember this, and this is why history gets very, very muddy and difficult to navigate sometimes, because the amount of times things get repurposed and reused and lived in and reconstructed and renovated and et cetera, over thousands and thousands of years. The Sphinx being a great example. That head is obviously a much later point than like the core of that body, and the amount of restoration that's been done on the feet alone is much newer, and it's all these places in Egypt have layers of different time on them, which sometimes people just grab one of those layers and then date it at that, when you're like, well, but there's been a lot of activity, and that's what makes it hard to date sometimes, right?
Yeah.
I'm
just going to give you my theory.
Please.
It's a little straightforward. No aliens or time portals, though I do enjoy Stargate, the series.
Great show.
But I don't believe in that kind of Stargate. Things have been going on for tens of thousands of years, and we've just lost sense of that. My assessment is this was a sacred site well before the Egyptian pharaohs, going back into prehistory. Whatever was there, I don't know. I don't have a lot to contribute to this debate. I just walk in, I feel the presence of the place, and I see the incongruities, and I think, wow, anomaly. I don't know what to do with it, but it's cool. What I do think is that this and the site of the Great Pyramid itself were probably sacred sites with some sort of shrine going back thousands of years before Egypt. And so very often people will use the same site and repurpose it.
Yeah.
Right? The next culture will keep it and they'll build something else on it. The original sacred site could be a tree.
Mm-hmm.
And the tree gets burned down and then they'll put a stone pillar there. And the stone pillar gets knocked down and then they'll put a little shrine there. Actually, if you don't mind.
Please.
Oh, yeah, this is the next picture. This is outside of Saqqara, and it's just one of these mastaba temples, and it has these vertical shapes on the outside, and those are representative of pillars so it's a royal facade of pillars of the palace. But as many scholars have noted, the pillars themselves were taken from tent poles. So the original metaphor of these vertical pillars was actually the traveling tent.
Oh.
Right? The original temple is a tent, much like the temple in the Bible. What do you call it? Oh my gosh, I've got a brain freeze.
That's all good.
I'm doing a video series on myth in the Bible. I can't remember. Tabernacle, thank you.
There we go.
The tabernacle was a tent. And so the pre-pharaonic people, whoever they were, had sacred shrines that were tents. And they had probably tent cities, tent shrines, right? And from that, we get this architecture. And eventually that develops into pyramids and temples of the pyramids. Okay, so then that tells us things have been going on for a long time. The original sacred site then of this, in the Great Pyramid, the subterranean chamber is unfinished subterranean chamber, right? It's this fissure in the rock.
Right.
Well, that could have been the original shrine. That could have been the place where they did their offerings, did their religious rituals, buried their dead, prayed for the ascent of the soul for the dead, coronated the king, right? Whatever they were doing, and that's why the pyramid gets built there. And it's the same with the Sphinx. It's a place, a sacred site. It goes back probably well into prehistory, and it's been reused and repurposed for a very long time. The whole argument of the Sphinx stones, I'll let all the academics, I think is very interesting, and I think it's Robert Schoch's most compelling piece of information.
I'd say so, yeah.
And so, but people have noticed the geology of it long before Robert Schoch. I mean, it was Schwaller de Luwix who mentioned it in one of his books, and so.
Yep.
Again, the geology isn't difficult. It just presents us with a great historical mystery. And the point I was making is, if there's a chamber underneath that paw, it probably was the original shrine that belonged to the people who built the tents.
Right.
Who were semi-nomadic and migrating through and doing their rituals, and then over centuries and millennium, it turns into this.
Interesting.
All right, I just put that in there to mention.
No.
All right.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, I'm like, I hope you got this one in here. Great.
So then this is the Assyrian, and
that's just a whole other level in my mind.
It's very early dating. It's old. The farther you go back in Egyptian architecture, the more complex it is.
I know.
And this is it should be the other way around.
Yeah.
Right? It should get more complex the later you go, but it reaches a peak at the Great Pyramid, and it's downhill after that. But this is, before the Great Pyramid, and it's huge, massive megalithic stones that are being constructed in this subterranean temple
I know.
that has a creation series, a creation story carved into it. Again, you have to be there to experience it. I've got several great photos of it, but I just want to show. Right now, it's just a hole in the ground.
I know.
And you could just walk by and think, oh, okay, more Egyptian stuff. But you realize that there's actually some of the biggest blocks being used, some of the most complex architecture, and it's one of the oldest temples. And so you're like, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it jumps out at me because, one, the architecture is actually quite different than a lot of the typical Egyptian architecture you see in dynastic Egypt and et cetera. From that point onwards, there's no hieroglyphs. And if there are, they do look like they were added on a little bit later.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
There's nothing. What's interesting, and this goes maybe more, maybe not Neolithic, but back to times when you see other structures like in Baalbek or places where they don't have, like Stonehenge, where they don't have any real engravings on them. They're not artwork with beautiful hieroglyphs that you see all over Egypt. This has none of that. It's like a very different architectural style, and it's the most difficult. They are the biggest megaton blocks that typically, and I don't know what it is with the Assyrian here, but typically they're not from the region, meaning they have to get quarried a long way.
Quarried and imported from 150 miles away.
Right? Like not
or
easy.
Longer.
Or longer. Why? Why do, like, there's so many questions. Why use this type? Why cut such big blocks? For what purpose? How did they do it? If we're going back into time, we're supposed to be more primitive. Why are we doing the most advanced construction further back in time? I mean, that's all the questions that pop out of your head when you go to a site like this.
No, I agree. And and to notice that there's hardly any hieroglyphs. I almost call them petroglyphs. They are petroglyphs. They're carved in stone.
Yeah.
Hardly any hieroglyphs, and they probably were added on later. This tells you that this was built during a time when the hieroglyphs weren't the medium of the message.
Exactly.
The medium of the message was the building and the rituals that occurred inside it.
Right.
And you didn't write those down. It took centuries for people to adopt writing, not because they weren't smart enough, but because they didn't trust it. Right? This whole argument with Plato, I mean, this is a rabbit trail, but in one of Plato's writings, King Ammon is being told by Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing, I think it's him, that I'm going to give you a gift and it'll, make everything better. It's writing. And the king says, no, that'll make people stupider. Because we have to memorize it. We have to encode it on everything. Everything's related. And if you write it down, you disconnect it from what we observe. And after a while, that means your little scratches on the paper can mean anything you want them to mean. And sure enough, that's exactly why most of our writing is legal documents.
Right.
Because writing allows anyone to make shit up. And so that there you have it. So
and it's John, you say that because it makes me think immediately this kind of the prejudice that goes towards oral history versus written history. And if it's not written, then it's not quote unquote proper history. But like you just said, if you're writing it down, you can make anything up. And in a way, it just goes back to that we need to look also into our oral history just as skeptically, but also as seriously as we do with our written history.
That's correct. Sadly, almost all the oral history is permanently gone. There's not much to recover. It's evaporated.
Yeah.
Oral history, again, we only have access to it through text. And, well, and I guess there's your first problem.
Yeah. I mean, there's some wisdom keepers. And if you go to, like you were saying too, certain Native American tribes will inherit from another one, and maybe there could be some passed down. But you're right. I mean, obviously that is the con of the oral tradition.
Yeah,
sure.
it's 99% gone. And,
awesome.
And that's just what we have. So,
yeah,
right. It is its own sophisticated metaphysics, highly sophisticated, highly intelligent, and we've totally underestimated it. That doesn't mean we should romanticize the past. Look at this structure.
I know.
Well, how many man hours do you think that took? And who did it? Were they slaves? Were they paid workers? Were they? I mean, I don't know.
And I would love to see how we would do it again today with the same materials. I would love to see how a modern day construction would build that, because I think it would give everyone a very, like, you'd see the massive custom cranes that would probably have to come in and start moving things around, just to show people that this is not an easy piece of architecture. This is not an easy piece of engineering. This is different.
Actually, nobody, I think, could duplicate it. You would have to have an unlimited budget.
Yeah.
If you gave someone an unlimited budget that was a very sophisticated rock mason and engineer and mathematician, over a couple generations, we could reduplicate this. But we would have to relearn all the techniques. And right now, we don't know them.
Right.
When a new technology is invented, the old technology generally gets lost. And so the new technology was not megalithic building. It was something else. And so actually, again, writing takes over. We can now write our cosmologies and our mathematics on a scroll.
Right.
Whereas we used to had to have built them. And so it's the new technology of writing slowly displaces this kind of thinking.
It's interesting, though, then now when you say that, it makes me think like this was their way of almost, and arguably they accomplished this, which was that they made their writing timeless, because they wrote it with stone, if you want to call how they built these things, writing. And if that is their mode of communication of these messages with these structures, then they've actually accomplished what they may have set out to do, which was to create a timeless record, almost a really kind of a timestamp, or a way of chronicling a time where people were obviously in a very different way of being, but that still exists right now. That lasts more than any form of written history, and certainly oral. So maybe this is the real method of maintaining a message over thousands of years.
I think there are probably a few ancient priests and architects who designed this and said, our message for eternity is, we were the smartest people here. And within a few thousand years, they've all been relegated to howling barbarians.
I think you're onto something, John.
So as ironic and comedic as that is, this is what we tell ourselves. We are the smartest people here. Look at our rocket ships and our microchips and our skyscrapers. Well, 5,000 years from now, what will people say of us?
Right.
I promise you, we'll just be howling barbarians. That's how it is.
Yeah.
So
get
over it, people.
Well,
all right, one more. I think I have one more picture I just wanted to pop up. This
beautiful.
One is the Serapeum. And I actually had a hard time getting good shots down here, but it's this
tough lighting.
Huge subterranean complex with these little niches all over the place. And inside these niches, I mean, I have pictures of those that I didn't put in here, are these 70-ton sarcophagi. Right? Yeah. And look, and there's like 12 inches of space between the sides of the sarcophagus and the rock chamber niche, right?
Yeah.
So they had to slide it down, turn several right angles, and then get it into the little niche. How in the? I mean. Yeah.
And
there were a couple of them.
Yeah.
I could not figure out how. It's like moving a couch into a basement.
Except that's still easier, because my God, these
the couch is 70 tons of granite.
Well, exactly, right. And I mean, if our listeners are interested, me and myself and Brennan, the archaeologist who was on this trip with myself and John, we talked about it in our first episode here of Ancient Mysteries Unearthed a little bit, was the Serapeum and the anomalies and these odd shaped sarcophagi, if you want to call them that. But these were granite boxes that, weighed around 70 tons. And that granite was quarried in Aswan, which is approximately 1,000 kilometers away.
Right.
insane, and then getting it in there, and then what was the purpose, etc. I mean, the questions are just endless. It is also, the images of those things look like a bloody sci-fi film. Honestly, it's crazy.
Well, both the Assyrian and the Serapeum, it is like you're walking into a science fiction script,
Yeah.
a fantasy script. It's like, what is this place? This doesn't belong here. This is, and again, this is very old stuff, and this is very complex stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, we were at Saqqara, the pyramid at Saqqara, and they've discovered a huge subterranean labyrinth of tunnels and chambers there, filled with thousands of mummies, animal mummies, human mummies. You know, the truth of the matter is, I bet, despite all that's been discovered, more has not been discovered
every day, you know. And that's like the core of really this channel. And I know a lot of the research you're doing, John, and of obviously myself and everyone that was on that trip with us, it's a never-ending mystery, and it just gets crazier the more you learn, and the more the more down this rabbit hole you go, the more you have respect for the ancients, but the more you're curious, and it's a mystery, and we just don't know. But it's fascinating. So if that's your last photograph, I think that's a perfect time to wrap up the podcast here. And before we do, let's do a little plug for yourself at the end here. We can get everything. So I know John's mentioned his website before, but let's lay it all out, John, for the audience, where they can see you online, connect with you on social media, and of course, if they're interested in this amazing trip, let's give them the information.
Yeah, www.johnlundwall.com. You can look up on YouTube. Just type my name in, John Lundwall, and my YouTube channel comes up. It's not near as sophisticated as Chris's YouTube channel is. But I do have, sadly, you know, I try to get content up, but my archaeoastronomy videos, I've got like 3 up. They take a long time to do.
Incredibly time consuming.
It's a lot of research, but the video itself, there's graphics, there's 3D modeling, there's, you know, it's very time consuming, and I don't have a huge staff. Oh wait, I just have me. So so they slowly come out, but you can follow my work along there. You can, you know, look me up on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, and I've got a couple books out.
And what are those books on, John?
Well, the big one is Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age, where I discuss ancient history. Why does it look so strange? And then I re-look at history through the lens of how oral peoples think and how literate peoples think, the transition between the two. And I immediately, right up at the top, throw away some of our modern biases, and I just say, look, you know, I have my own bias, and here it is. People in the ancient world were just as smart as we were. We are. We do not. Yeah. Intelligence did not evolve. What did evolve is the wiring of the brain, and that created different capacities, different potentialities, opened some up, closed some off. But people who painted the paintings in Lascaux in France, 35,000 BCE, they're just as smart as we are today. They just had different tools. They had different metaphysics. So let's talk about how does a society function and transmit knowledge if it has no writing or no concept of writing? And it's actually an impossible question to answer, because it's a completely different epistemology. We can't step back into that world. But and so my book explores human intelligence in ancient history. It explores orality and literacy, and then I turn my gaze onto ancient myth systems, and I reinterpret them using what I've just gone through. So I talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh, the labors of Heracles, and a couple stories in the Old Testament.
Well, that's great. And for the viewers and listeners to the podcast, that'll all be in the description on the YouTube link to this video. So I'm going to get all this information from John after we record this, and I will post it in the description so you guys can check out the links to his Amazon, to his books on Amazon, and the tours and the website and social media. So Anything else, John, or is that pretty much it?
Well, there's always something else, but I'm
I
done.
know, right?
So,
Well, what do you got? You know what? Rather than that, what do you have on the horizon? What's next on the research front?
actually, the fall equinox is coming up in a couple weeks, so I'm heading down with a big team of people to Clear Creek Canyon. We hiked the southwestern bluff where the winter solstice sunset occurs. We are going to hike the southeastern bluff where the winter solstice sunrise occurs. We didn't do that before because that actually is a hike I do not want to do. It is a sheer cliff. And they would do it. Fremont would do it.
Sure they would, yeah.
And so what am I doing? I'm bringing down a caravan of ATVs. We're going to fly the back side of it and get on top of the bluff and then see if we can find anything, any kind of rock cairns.
That's great. That's great. Okay, well, thank you so much, John, for being on the show today. We're going to have you back because obviously there's so much more to discuss, not just with archaeoastronomy, but obviously with the myths that you're so familiar with and the amazing research you've done. So thanks so much for being on the show. And to the audience watching, make sure you check us out on Facebook and Instagram, Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. And as always, let's leave some comments below. Any questions you have for future episodes, or you just want to comment on the things we discussed today, happy to talk about it. So just link that down below in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe. And thanks again, John, for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Fantastic. Okay, everyone, we'll catch you next time on Ancient Mysteries Unearthed.
Well, there you have it, folks. What an incredible conversation I got to have today with John Lundwall. John, thank you so much for coming onto the show today. All of John's information will be below in the description. He's got his website, social media connections, and of course the links to his amazing trips and his books. We've got about 5% of the puzzle at most. We do not know where we come from and who we are. We're just putting together the pieces of a much larger puzzle right now. So there's a lot more to the story of humanity. So thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate it. If you have any comments, please leave them below. I would love to hear all about your thoughts on the episode. Questions for future episodes, also leave in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Catch you next time on Ancient Mysteries Unearthed.